Good afternoon. I am Carol Turchik, Director of the Xavier Leadership Center. We would like to welcome you today to the Xavier Leadership Center and the Xavier University's Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion's webinar on racism in the workplace, facilitating dialogue and responding to racism. Our panelists today are Carolyn Craig, Tracy Duist, and Dr. Taj Smith. Ms. Craig is the founder and president of Melange Consulting, a diversity, equity, and inclusion training and consulting firm. Her areas of expertise include diversity, equity, and inclusion, implicit unconscious bias, culture competency, employee resources groups, and more. She has over 20 years of professional experience as a business executive and diversity and inclusion leader, including 13 years with Procter & Gamble, and her impact and influence has extended throughout corporations, small businesses, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, educational institutions, and nonprofits. Welcome, Carolyn. Next, we have Tracy Duist. She is the Associate Director in the Xavier University Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. Tracy leads and facilitates diversity and inclusion professional development workshops, oversees the supplier diversity program, affinity and caucus groups, and coordinates the ADA initiatives. She's also very passionate about her employee advocacy role and works tirelessly to provide support and guidance for individuals as well as teams. Also joining us today is Dr. Taj Smith. Dr. Smith is a diversity and social justice education consultant who's passionate about curriculum and program development, cultural humility, and bridge building. For 4 years, he served as Xavier University's Director of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. He has a wealth of experience facilitating difficult conversations, supporting climate study processes, and creating and developing diversity-related strategic planning initiatives. He currently sits on a steering committee for the Levine Center to End Hate in Rochester, New York. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge and expertise in this area with us today. All right, I'm going to switch now to the panel so we can start our discussion. So welcome all of you. Appreciate having you here today. For our first question today, we're going to start off with Dr. Smith. Why does diversity matter in the workplace?
Sure, thank you. Good to be here with everyone today. So there's a few different reasons why it matters. And so one of those reasons is sense of belonging, right? In any workplace, any home as well, but any workplace, people want to have a sense of belonging. So it's important that we understand where people are come from, that they feel valued in the workplace for their unique identities, whatever those identities are, whether they be around race, gender, sexuality, religion, etc. All of those folks should feel like they're part of the institution. Then we want to focus on retention, right? So diversity is also important because we want to retain quality people who have talent. We do not want to lose people simply because they don't feel like they're belonging or they feel like their diversity isn't represented. And so when an organization has that happen, they lose out on talent and then that talent goes somewhere else. Then we have productivity, all right? And so productivity really in the sense of if people aren't feeling like they're connected, they're likely to become disengaged. They're not going to work at the same level or the same pace, all right? And so with that, that means that work isn't getting done as best as it can, right? Because people have things on their mind around diversity, whether they experience a form of discrimination in the workplace that has just taken up a lot of time, space, and energy, rightfully so, as it should. And so organizations that are not responsive to that, not thinking about that, lose out on productivity. There's a data point that I'll share with you. It's from Gallup. About $550 billion is lost as a result of disengagement. Okay, so it's real money we're talking about losing when people aren't feeling like they are able to produce at the same level. Then we have better problem solving. Okay, when you have a diverse workforce, you're able to solve different and unique and complex problems. All right. Traditionally, if you only have folks who are similar to you in thought, similar to you in the kind of profession that you do, you're going to come away with the same answers every time, or most of those times. So the more diversity you have on your workforce means that those folks who have different cultures, different ways of analyzing the world, different ways of approaching problems can really work to solve these complex problems that we face in the world today. And then the final one has to do with around bottom line, right? As an organization or people part of an organization, we all have to think about what is the bottom line in terms of our finances. So new hires, when people are leaving and because they're disengaged or because they don't feel a sense of belonging, right? That costs money to replace them, right? So we have to open up new search processes, et cetera, spend more money rather than figuring out how can we ensure that these people don't leave so that we don't, one, so that we have good talent, but two, that we're not wasting this money on really trying to keep hiring people over and over and filling a slot. If I look at some data point there, I believe it's pronounced the CAPOR or the CAPOR Center, they reported that about $16 billion is spent on that process of trying to rehire people or when people leave the institution. You also find that the bottom line is helpful for just wanting to move up the career ladder, right? As we move up the career ladder and diversity is a core value, you need to have those skills and those practical experiences to be able to showcase that you can move up and deal with a diverse range of people, particularly if you're at the supervisor or manager level. That's really core and important skills to develop. If you don't have those, the folks who are working under you or working with you will recognize that, and they won't work as hard for you as they could because they notice that you lack some inclusive leadership skills. Another piece is around the marketing. So if you're in a marketing profession or you market a product of some kind, you should want to maximize how much money you can make, right? So the best way to think about that is diversity is valuable because if you understand the different populations that you can market your product to, you're going to create more streams of revenue, more money is going to come in. But if you're only marketing your product to one specific group and only thinking through that lens, you're limiting yourself from making additional dollars. And then the last one I'll end with is really social responsibility, right? And that should be a core part of any organization. When we are not engaged in a diverse, inclusive, and equitable environment, that can sort of be in question. So we see that now with a lot of Black Lives Matter protests and other movements out there, where some organizations are responding and they're seeing a financial benefit from being more socially responsible, and folks are not boycotting them. They're not boycotting their product or what they stand for. And so the consumer, you know, in this way has a fair amount of power and requires most organizations to have some sense of responsibility around social issues, or at least the community in which they reside, right? So I'll end there and pass it to my colleagues to really dive into some race and ethnicity reasons of why that is important to the workplace.
So what we'll talk about here is the human aspect, but there is a real economic business reason also for making sure you're doing the right work.
Yeah. And so just to add a little bit to what Taj said, you know, especially that piece about the bottom line in terms of that creativity and innovation, there is data after data and both qualitative and quantitative data supports that the more diverse the team is, the more and better ideas that you can get from that team. So that's proven. And so as companies are thinking about, you know, how do I drive my growth in the future? They are looking for folks that are creative and innovative and coming to the table with different, what we call cultural lens on things. And so that is one reason. So that racial and ethnic diversity also helps in that sense as well. The other place that it plays out is, as he said, is around marketing, right? So if more and more each day, consumers are becoming more and more savvy. And they want to see folks that look like them in the companies that they're supporting and the brands that they're supporting. They absolutely want to see themselves in the marketing and all that type of stuff. So when you have folks that have the racial and ethnic background that kind of mirrors not only what's happening in this country in terms of diversity in ethnicity, but also, you know, in your target base, then it helps again to bring that cultural lens to the table when you're having those conversations around, you know, what this brand and how should we market the same brand? Because anyone will tell you that you can have the same brand, but you may have to market it differently to different groups depending on, you know, some racial ethnic background, some cultural background. So having that cultural lens and that cultural competency is also important. The other piece about internally is, you know, you're bringing more diverse people into the organization, and as they're moving up the ladder, you need to have leaders that represent. And anyone that knows this generation of our millennials and our centennials that are coming up, it's almost like a mandate. It's the one thing that they are looking for. And it's one of the questions that they will ask in interviews in terms of, you know, what is diversity in your organization? They will do a ton of research to see who are your senior leaders, who's on your board of directors, who exactly am I going to be reporting into, and what does that look like, right? What are some of the ERGs and affinity groups that you have in place for folks, you know, like me, that look like me, that are my age or my race and ethnicity? So a lot of reasons that in all of that impacts the bottom line, right? So as he said, if we can recruit and retain, if our employees, diverse employees into our companies, if we can, you know, make sure that we have that cultural lens on when we're doing our marketing, then, you know, that affects our bottom line. And of course, you know, that pipeline that we're looking for in terms of leadership.
Great.
And Taj and Carolyn were very extensive. So I am just going to say something really briefly, because I know there's a bunch of other questions we want to get through. They may have already said this, but for me, I think of being more effective in building relationships and collaboration. And I have a quote that I just found prior to the panel that says the value of a diverse team is its capacity to challenge the norm or groupthink and thus boost organizational performance and improve decision-making. So I really like that. I think Taj and Carolyn covered the rest. And all I would say from a personal standpoint, and this really more connects to the human side, is that I'm clear that being open to learning from different people has made me think, see, and feel differently, widened my lens, and just made me a better human being as far as being effective in connecting with people.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Thank you. So staying on that kind of human side, you know, as a white person, how do I begin to respond on a personal level?
Tracy, you want to take that?
Oh, sorry. I don't know why it's doing that, but okay.
I actually think that, did we want to go to the question about the current racial climate first, or do we want to go to that one? Just
go ahead.
Okay.
Talk about the current racial climate.
So it's clear that in our country, we're dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of needs, a lot of concerns, issues of social justice, issues of human rights. And so the racial climate, you know, I think you can turn on your television, you can turn on your social media, and you will see all these daily messages, you know, about our racial climate. And it creates this sense of urgency, right? And so we're sort of curious on, we want to be able to ask you through a poll, you know, what is the racial climate at your institution? And do you feel your institution is prepared to have these kind of conversations? So if we can start the poll and allow people to participate in that, and then we'll reply with some remarks after that.
Okay, great. We'll do the poll here. All right, everyone, we're gonna do a poll real quick. And if you have any issues with the poll, go ahead and use the chat feature. But what we're gonna ask is, do you think your organization is prepared to have open, racialized, and anti-racist conversations? So we want you to say yes, no, or somewhat, and then we'll talk about that. Hold on, I'm gonna launch that right now. So let us know what you think. Do you think your organization is prepared to have open, racialized, and anti-racist conversations? Okay, just so pretty much most people have answered here. I'll give it a couple more seconds. All right, so I'm gonna end this poll, and then I'm gonna go ahead and share our results with everyone. Okay, so it looks like 41% said yes, 19% said no, and then 40% said somewhat. And then I'll read some of the comments here. Let's see. Some people feel it's a little bit more into the somewhat to yes. Go ahead and chat if you want about why you kind of made your comments. Are there some things out there that reasons why you think they're either prepared or not prepared for these conversations? We'll take a second for people to share, and we'll talk about that.
And Carol, I'll just say that,
Yeah.
you know, this poll is representative of what we're seeing. Certainly there's been a shift, right? So some of these companies that said yes may have not said yes before, but certainly within the last couple of months, we've seen a shift. And so this is the norm. And yes, are there still folks that are like, you know, where do we get started with this? Which is, you know, okay too. So when we saw the no's, I really want to say to those folks that, you know, those are the companies that folks like me are getting calls for to say, you know, we really want to be a part of this conversation. We really want to be a part of the solution. We just don't know where to get started, right? So it's not that we're finding that people are just like, no, we're not going to do it. It's just we don't know where to get started. But the results of the poll are consistent with what we're seeing now.
So it's some of the, your point, Carolyn, a lot of the responses are that they feel they're willing, but they're not prepared. Some people don't feel safe discussing. There's a lot of talk, but no action.
Right.
Some answered somewhat because the team's open and willing, but unsure how to facilitate that. Hopefully today, that's a good place for you to be here today. And then some constituents are very eager, but others are not. So they don't know what to do when it's mixed. The topic's been broached. There may be recognition of what it means and how challenging it is, beyond saying we're not racist. So they can say we're not racist, but then they don't know what to do, you know, after.
Right.
Yeah, so our organization sees the value in conversations and the value of diversity. So that's good. Some leaderships are actually seeing that. And then some leaderships actually are open and want to address it before they become problems. So that's good too. Yeah. So Taj, what, or anyone actually, how have organizations responded in the climate?
Sure, I could start. So what I've seen, usually the sort of typical way they have responded is with a statement, right? And sort of saying, this organization, we're against the racism or police brutality specifically that we've seen in our country. So some start there, and which I think is a good place to start. There's also several organizations that have had delayed statements. And I know in talking with colleagues or just working with some of these organizations, it wasn't on the mind of their leadership that this was important to make a comment on. They might have felt individually that something was wrong about the situations, but they questioned what was the role of the company, the corporate, the corporate organization. How do we make a stand? Where is our role? To me, then that indicates, right, that there hasn't been pre-work done around having conversations about race and racism, because now this is a crisis situation. So many people respond across different industries, higher education, and et cetera, all respond typically in a crisis management situation. There is no blueprint, no plan, because there wasn't quality conversations happening before. So that's what I've generally seen. Once people get past that, and then I'll end here and allow my colleagues to share, what I've seen is then frantically figuring out, what do we have to do, right? Let's get a workshop, let's get a training on this and that. Sometimes there's clear direction on what folks need, and then a lot of times when I talk with some organizations, they don't really know what they need. And so there's a requirement of coaching through, what is it that your organization needs? Do you need a conversation about white privilege, right? Is that the place to start? Do people get white privilege in your organization? Can we move to more structural things like policy and looking at those things? And so, that's generally what I've seen, kind of stepping out of corporate a little bit and looking at some of the art field. I know in some of those spaces, they've asked, what is the role of the artist? How does the artist as a worker now, especially as a Black worker or Latino worker, right, who's doing their art, how can their art be more amplified, right? How can it be more showcased? Or what do board compositions look like, right? So some groups are asking these kind of questions, but I'll end there and pass it on to my colleagues.
Yeah. I think the only things I'll add is for some of the companies, there's been like town hall meetings. So I am involved in a lot of community calls for DEI, professionals like myself across the country and across the nation, in the world. And so we're hearing a lot of that being called in to kind of facilitate a lot of those types of things. They're using their employee resource groups as a resource to kind of navigate some of these conversations, because most of them will have some type of racial ethnic group. And so they're utilizing them to kind of have those conversations or to kind of, facilitate. People are sharing, and so we can talk more about, what that looks like, for Black employees, but, that's also happening in some of those ERG meetings and some of those. And when I say employee resource groups, it's not just the group. It's like, senior leaders are coming into the conversation, or they're opening up, Zoom calls to other folks to kind of have the deep dive conversation around race and kind of what's really happening in their organization. The other thing I'm seeing is senior leaders are becoming very focused, and C-suites are becoming very focused on having the conversation themselves, bringing in folks to kind of really educate them on what really is happening. The other thing that, especially when everything started to happen, folks would call and say, from a human standpoint, I get it, that was wrong, some of these things that are happening are wrong, but the piece around racial justice, I don't understand. Right. And so help me understand that, because I can't lead an organization when I don't even understand the premise. Right. So we talk about, education and some other things. But so I've seen just organizations in higher education as well. And so, you see task force, racial task forces, you see diversity task forces that, maybe weren't there before. A lot of folks are starting to think about, we don't have a diversity committee. Should we have one? Just a lot of stuff. And then all those activities, race and ethnicity are kind of driving those conversations, right? And it needs to expand beyond just that, but right now it's driving a lot of the conversation.
Yeah. So to your point, one of the chats is that, the organization is led predominantly by white male leadership. So some of the things that you've all described really are things that need to be in place, because people are hearing diversity from a non-diverse group. So, as you said, they're starting to create employee resource groups and diversity councils and things to kind of adjust and adhere to that. Any comments on what happens in those situations, or some of the things that would be helpful?
So I think we're going to cover some best practices at the end, and so that'll come in that conversation piece.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would add, and I'll take this and then go right into the question, Carol. The only thing I would really add to what Taj and Carolyn have already said is just the people I've talked to, whether they be internally at Xavier or other organizations or friends that might be texting me knowing I do the work, is there's a hesitancy and a nervousness combined. So in other words, can you look at this letter that we're going to send out to the company? A question I'm remembering is, what happens if somebody that might have somebody in the police force is offended by me sending this letter out? So, wanting to do the right thing, not having any kind of understanding of systemic focus. So I'm just doing a lot of empathy. People are apologizing that they feel like they don't know what they're saying when I'm on the phone with them. That might also relate to, like, a call I had last week was about wanting to create a diversity and inclusion strategic plan, like they don't even have a plan within the organization and where to start with that. And again, I think feeling ill-equipped and a little bit badly about that. So I kind of navigate that space. And I know that goes on to the next question, Carol, where it says, as a white person, how do I begin to respond on a personal level? So I can just kind of segue into that. I think there's all kinds of ways. I'm just going to certainly tell you either the ways that I have or the ways that I try to maneuver things on campus and in my personal life. The first thing I would say is listen, listen, and listen. And I think trying to focus on causing less harm by building emotional resiliency versus white fragility. I just heard a quote yesterday. I was on a webinar called Embodied Activism, and it was by a queer woman of color, and it really stuck with me as far as like what we as white people need to pay attention to. And she said, I don't want to be in the room while someone else is learning that I'm human. And that just kind of dropped in. So we have to think about building our own emotional resiliency. As an example, at Xavier, we have a group called the Aspiring Anti-Racist Allies for white identified staff and faculty. And with the civil unrest, our group has tripled over the last month and a half. And so for the summer, we've actually been meeting weekly. During the year, we were meeting monthly. So we have increased the frequency of our meetings and are looking into different resources. I also would say that be sure you're not unintentionally asking a person of color to educate you. This might sound a little flip, but there's definitely Google, so definitely use Google. And also, I think there's more resources that I've seen on social media and spaces that I'm in about books and films and podcasts. And actually, Taj was the one that posted this on Facebook, and it reminded me to say this in context of resources, that be sure that you're not just watching, listening, and reading, but also be sure you're having conversations about what you're watching, listening, and reading, okay? Because then we can also, as white people, work through our feelings, our guilt, our shame, and things that come up. I would recommend in this space just a couple of resources, and we will share some later if you obviously sign up for the series. Most recently, I really enjoyed the podcast On Being with Dr. Resmaa Menakem and Robin DiAngelo. Also appreciated an interview on a podcast with Brene Brown and Dr. Ibram Kendi. And there's also a podcast literally called Seeing White. And so I would just throw those out there as some of the more recent resources for you to begin to explore your own white identity development and what it means to be an anti-racist.
And I think the other question, right, that then comes to mind is, how do I respond as a Black person or African-American person in this space, right, at work with everything that's going on? And certainly the first thing I'd say is breathe, take care of self first, right? You have the right to feel however you feel. And right now we're feeling a lot of stuff, right? And so it's okay to feel those things. There's nothing wrong with it. But what I'm finding is that beyond that, you'll have some, African-Americans and Black folks that want to, what I call step into the battle. So they're the ones that are willing to share their stories in the town halls. They're the ones that are leading the employee resource groups and, sharing their lived experiences, leading the change. And then, and there are those of us that are out marching and then coming to work, right? So there's a lot of different ways. And then those of us that are going into the C-suite and educating them. Right. And so, but as a Black person, you choose what is best for you. And then also make sure that you are, doing the things that you need to do to make sure you're healing and you're able to move forward. I think the challenge is, and I was on a call yesterday and the person pointed out and said, to Tracy's point, why I don't want to always be the person that everybody comes to when they have questions about things, right? But I am the only person of color at the table. So I tend to get all of the questions. And so how do I navigate that space when a lot of times we are the only person? And I may or may not feel like that day, depending on what's happening, and then throw COVID-19 on top of that, right? And the disparity, right, the disparities around that with African Americans and the concern about families and things like that. And some days I just don't feel like having that conversation, right? And so I tell people, you choose when you want to have that conversation. Now, part of being in leaders and things like that comes some additional responsibility, but we're still all human. And so, you know, that's how I've navigated the space even before now. In my 20-something year in corporate, I choose to step into battle, have always chosen to step into battle, but for those who didn't, I made sure that because I was willing to do it, their voices were also heard as well. So, you know, it may not be my lived experience, but I certainly can use it as an example to say, you've got a diverse group of folks here, so you can't just look at my lived experience or someone else's. And then when we talk about some best practices, you know, we'll talk about how companies can, and organizations can really support, you know, their Black community of workers and folks as they are trying to navigate both what's happening right now and, you know, around the racial justice piece, but also COVID-19.
Great point. We haven't even talked about that on top of everything else. So, but everyone's aware of our situation and our times right now. So, so that's a great point, that you never know what someone's actually going through other than these things as well. So it's important to do self-care and then to appreciate others who need or want to self-care as well. So great point. Thank you.
I was just going to add on, it's also important as we're navigating all of this, and we typically think about, when we think about race and racism in this country, it's usually a Black-white dynamic, and particularly an African-American white dynamic. And so in your workplaces, in your organizations, you might have folks who identify as people of color, but not as a Black person or not as an African-American person. And so what do they do in this situation, right? When this dialogue, this conversation is happening, acknowledging that sometimes that may feel like they're being othered, that they're left out. So I acknowledge that human reaction, but how do you respond to that if you're a person of color not in those categories, around Black Lives Matter, right? Around anti-Black racism. And what you can do is first start off with trying not to, as hard as it may be, to engage in a oppression Olympics. All right. What I mean by that is sort of saying my oppression is more important than this group's oppression. And I think all groups can do this, all individuals can do this, so everyone has to be mindful. But in this case, it's sort of saying, as a person of color who doesn't identify as Black, right, how can I put my situation aside for this moment and try to support this particular movement? And hopefully you get that in return, right? Then moving towards, how does my community perhaps perpetuate this sort of anti-Blackness, right? How in my community, if I identify as Asian or South Asian specifically, or as Korean, within those communities, how are Black people talked about in those spaces? And is there racism or racist language or conversations being had in those spaces? I too can then challenge those spaces because I'm a part of that space, right? So that becomes a very useful strategy. And of course, demand and also push for issues of racism that affect your particular group at the end of the day as well. So it's really this complex relationship, but we wanted to acknowledge that typically how we think about race in this country is a Black-white dynamic, and other groups of people of color do experience race and racism, and certainly can be involved in sort of Black Lives Matter movement. So we just wanted to be able to name that in case there was anyone on the call with that kind of perspective or question.
And I think before we go to the last question, this is more particularly related to white folks, but certainly could pertain to folks of color as well. But it's in the spirit of, it's been posted on Facebook, and in the spirit of like, everybody's got to find their own way to do something. So it says some are posting on social media, some are protesting in the street, some are donating silently, some are educating themselves, some are having tough conversations with friends and family. A revolution has many lanes. Be kind to yourself and to others who are traveling in the same direction. Just keep your foot on the gas. Carol?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about where we go from here. So just maybe some things that people can take away before we go to question and answer. But you know, what are your thoughts about where do we go from here?
So I think there's three things that you want to think about, right? What can I do as an individual? What can I do, right, as an organization? So how do I help as a leader or impact my organization? And then that community piece. So we've said over and over, I think here around, owning your individual understanding and learning, continue to not only read and do all that, but to have those courageous conversations and to navigate those conversations with family and friends. And, and it's okay to, have a conversation with someone that says, hey, all lives matter. And I tell people, I'm the first to tell you that all lives matter. But right now, I'm asking you to be a part of the conversation around Black Lives Matter, because you and I both agree that all lives matter. And right now, those lives are the ones that are most at stake. And so, those kinds of, just be willing to have those conversations and to give people grace. So commit to that. Continue to educate yourselves around, bias and identity, cultural competency. And I also say this is true for organizations. So individuals can do it, but organizations need to really, really commit to that, because to have on a cultural lens, you have to understand and have a high level of cultural intelligence, right? To make decisions in an organization that are not embedded with, race discriminatory and prejudice. You have to truly understand how bias, implicit bias that is, affects decision making. And how, our culture and our background and what we are taught to believe really affects the lens that we bring to our decision-making process. So continuing to do that. For organizations, continue to support, fund, and consult with their employee resource groups. Be open to new ones. Again, not only are we looking at and talking about racial justice, but we're still in the midst of a pandemic. And so, thinking about, right, because diversity and inclusion is about everyone. So thinking about our parents and thinking about, folks that may have older children at home. And, so we have employee resource groups. Are we open to new ones based on kind of where folks are right now, right? And so making sure that organizations are committed to inclusive practices and leadership. So continuing to really, really educate themselves, and again, to make sure that their practices and their policies and procedures. So, and that might take reviewing things, right? It might take putting a different lens on things now, and going back and looking at a policy and a procedure or recruiting practice or interviewing a practice that you've had in place forever, and saying, you know what, we need to make some changes here, right? To be more inclusive and to do all of that. And I think Tracy or someone mentioned, having a strategic diversity plan. But making sure that that plan is not sitting off by itself, but it's actually part of your overall strategic plan for the organization. So embedding that in there, having anti-racism personnel policies, pay equity. I mean, there's just a lot that organizations can do. I think the big thing is once you get past putting out your statement on your website, committing your money, right, those kinds of things, then the hard work is really internal. And continuing to do all these things I just talked about and even more, right? Because we got the whole equity piece as well, and making sure that folks are paying equity and that you're giving people living wages and not low wages. And I mean, there's just so much, right? So staying committed to all of that, even when somebody's not looking, kind of thing, I think is key. So I'm gonna turn it over to my counterparts to have them add to it as well.
Wanna go, Tosh?
Sure. Yeah, those are all great suggestions. I'll share a few. And Carolyn talked about policy analysis, to sort of focus in on one. You may or may not be aware of some policies that have been written around this, but hair. When we talk about hair and amongst diverse groups of people, including white folks in that conversation, hair has different value, right? Or different meaning to different people. So there's been some sort of places that have had to create anti-discrimination policy around hair, particularly that mostly impacts Black women, where Black women are having their hair touched or they're being judged based on how their hair looks. To give you a quick story about this is nothing new. Back when I was an undergrad and I was about to intern for ABC, the network company, one of my friends, a Black woman, went into the job. First day, was in an elevator with white women who were in the elevator, and no one spoke to her. Right? Part of it's because she's new, so there's a part of that. But then a few days later, people were speaking to her. Why? The only thing that shifted, that changed, was her hair. The first day she had sort of twist, if you will, semi braids. And then the next day when people were talking to her, she had straight hair. Right? And so you see there's unconscious biases or maybe intentional biases on the half of some of those white women in the elevator in terms of how they respond to their colleague who has a different hair texture or different hairstyle. So that's if that's something that's in your organization, figuring out what policy can be created. It's unfortunate we have to create one, but if you have to create one to sort of protect people. Another one I'll sort of focus on is definitely around leadership training. And for managers and supervisors, that's a must. I've worked at many different higher education institutions, but also talked to folks who work outside of those. And very rarely is there a training for supervisors and managers on anything, right? And so that's a gap. And included in that is something around diversity. So how do you work with a diverse population, right? Who is reporting to you? So that we can try to avoid complaints that I've heard over the years where, again, it's mostly women of color who have a white boss, usually who's cisgendered man identified, and their actions are interpreted as being problematic when another person does similar behaviors and is not judged in the same manner. And so what happens in this situation, using Black women specifically, the angry Black woman stereotype pops up. And now they're being judged through that lens, through their supervisor, when they might have done the same action as the other person's, or their action is being misinterpreted because of their skin color, right? As being, oh, you're talking back to me, right? Or you're not doing your job as well as you should be, right? If that commenting is consistent across racial identity, then the supervisor can be absolved of that racial, bias. The last thing I'll kind of point out is really being able to define terms, I think is important. We usually throw out diversity, inclusion, equity, multicultural, and not everybody's on the same page. So as an organization especially, it's important to be able to define that, because then that lets you know the direction you need to go in. So if you're talking about anti-racist behavior or being an anti-racist organization, truly understand what that means. Don't just sort of say it, but really embody it and understand what are the strategies that are necessary to come out of that. So defining, some of these terms are really important because they give you direction later down the road. Tracy?
Thank you. So a couple of things. I appreciated when Carolyn was talking about how we might think about different types of groups. And so I just am a big advocate for thinking about, when our students come back to campus, for example, what are we doing, not just for the students, but for staff and faculty around mental and emotional health with the pandemic still going on and the civil unrest. So there's a lot of things that people are handling that they normally do not handle. So I would advocate for really looking at what type of wellness offerings and things like that are you offering to the people and how you support them. I'm also paying attention to some of the things in the Q&A because I was interested in what people are asking. So some of what I'm going to say might address this. I'm going to really speak more Xavier specific at this point. But when we're thinking about hiring, we're getting ready to launch some hiring called Recruiting and Hiring for Inclusive Excellence. And so in that, we would be talking and addressing and requiring of our search committees to go through the training, which includes pieces on bias and requires applicants when they apply to Xavier to answer 1 or 2 questions around diversity and inclusion in their experience in that space. And additionally, we'll be asking 1 or 2 anti-racist questions as well. I also think that one of the things that we're grappling with is realizing that we have a definition in our harassment policy around racial harassment, but we do not have anything in there around racial bias. So to both Taj and Carolyn's point, when you're looking at policies, procedures, and practices, what's missing from an anti-racist lens that we should be looking at? And of course, anti-racism training. We are blessed here at Xavier that twice a year our cabinet does go through some training, and usually it is focused in the diversity and inclusion space. I also would say for people to really pay more attention to what their social media policies are saying. We've had a couple of things we've had to work through here, and I think we're realizing some gaps in that area as well. And then one example is in our career development office. What I appreciated recently was a discussion around some of the job descriptions that we're getting, particularly from police departments wanting to recruit our students. So we think that's great. We want to make sure that that's inclusive, but what we realized that there was some troublesome language. And so how we will address that is to add additional questions to our filtering process around not just diversity and inclusion, but also some anti-racist questions, and have the employees answer that so that we can really give all the information to the students so they can make a well-informed decision.
Great. So some, you know, a few or some really great answers about what to do for next steps. So we also know that we're limited on time. So we will end this session on some next steps that will carry on the conversation. But I wanted to welcome people to put in some Q&A to the chat that we could answer. One of the questions is, what do you think is the biggest barrier for people to put political, racial, gender, and many other affiliations to understand that that we're all for better life, dignity, and respect, and to be valued? So what do you think are those biggest barriers for people?
Well, I think, right, so part of our authenticity and having people bring their whole selves to work is all those things that were mentioned in that question. You absolutely want people to bring that to work, right? So that's part of that. But that conversation usually goes, that's who I am, and not understanding, okay, so this is who this other person is, and here's what we have in common, right? And so even when we do cultural intelligence, cultural competency training, you know, aha goes off for people because they're like, I see where we're different, but I also see what we're like, right? And then, I mean, you have, for most people, some people are very, their stance is very strong in what they believe and what they do. But back to, I think it was either Taj or Tracy saying, okay, but what is your company's or organization's definition of diversity? What is it of inclusion? What does that mean when we say that we're going to create an environment where all of our employees can bring their authentic selves to work? What does that look like? What is our policy and procedures around that? Because a lot of times over the years, I've had conversations with people that reported into me, or students that I was teaching who said, I don't believe in blah, because of whatever their reason was, I don't believe in this, right? And so, but you're gonna be talking about this, or you're saying, I have to call on this customer, right? Well, you took a job with a company that says, we're very clear about who we support, why we support them, blah, 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 right? So sometimes if the company doesn't have, or the organization isn't clear, like Taj said, about those things, then it's hard to have those conversations, or we're saying go into these courageous conversations where people are not gonna have them because they're just, you know, pretty stance on where they are. But cultural competency and training helps with that. It helps you to see that lens of, here's my cultural values, right? You learn other groups, racial and ethnic groups, cultural values, and you see the differences, but you also see a lot of similarities, right? It just may look a little bit different in terms of how we go about it, but it's still the same principle. So the stronger and the more people can get embedded into understanding and growing their cultural intelligence, the more I think it helps to drive that. But again, back to his point around organizations have to have policies and procedures and clear definitions of what they stand for, so that in a work environment, right, as a manager, it's easy for me to fall back on that, right? Because you can believe what you want, but in this work environment here that you agree to work in, here's how we will treat our people, our customers, and here's how we want you to show up.
Great answer. Thank you, Carolyn. And then we have another question of, as a person of color, how can I insert myself more in the recruiting process to ensure that there's more representation without bias? And that, you know, sometimes you're maybe the only person of color in a lot of those spaces. So how do I also become more of in that hiring and recruiting process?
Todd, you want to take that?
Sure, I think that's a good question, and it's going to depend on how your organization is structured, because each organization is a little different. But I would say at the very least, when a job becomes open, do you send it to your network? And assuming your network is full of a range of diverse people, then that becomes a productive space. So that's one way you see a job posting, you get it out there. Organizations have to help with that too. Traditionally, they put job descriptions in areas where not everybody sees them for a range of different reasons, or they're not identity specific locations. And so I would say find if there's some social media spaces or some organizations that have listservs that have a focus on a particular population you're looking to want to get more in the pool, make sure that job posting is there. So I think that's the sort of bare minimum that could be done. If you have more power and influence or rank or title at your organization, I would say use that too, when you can, and to sort of be that voice for folks who don't have the same level of rank or position as you do, to make sure that, hey, I know we got a job search open. Have we had a conversation about diversity, with the search committee or the group of the folks who are doing the hiring? I know some places managers might be the only ones doing the official hiring. This goes back to my point of why manager and supervisor training is important. And if they're the only ones doing the hiring, they have to have some kind of unconscious bias training in order to do that, because they don't have the benefit of having people from throughout the organization help them hire a person.
And the other thing I think I'll add is someone had asked the question, if I'm not, the manager and the leader, how can I be involved in that process? And one of the things that I'm always talking to organizations about, and I know we've done this in higher education and P&G in different places, is I may not be the person with the title, I may not be on the committee, I may not be the hiring manager, but as you're interviewing diverse candidates, and diversity meaning a whole lot of things, making sure that you engage some of those folks in the organization that might look like them, right? So, and I'll do this even as a manager myself. Using millennials for an example is, having someone in the organization that's also a millennial, less than 5 years with the organization, also engage with them. But certainly for racial and ethnic groups, making that part of the practice. But that person doesn't have to be someone that's a manager or leader, right? It could be just someone that's in the organization that's, been there or just came to it, but they can identify. And certainly for organizations, I've worked for organizations and been in very remote locations. And so when you're trying to recruit people and they're looking and they're saying, nobody in this community looks like me, but you want me to take a job here, right? Well, you utilizing those, to me, is where the employee resource groups come back. And I used to lead those a lot, and I even led those in higher education in Miami, tapping into those and utilizing those folks. And again, they may not be the ones with the titles, but they're there, they're in the organization. Hopefully they're thriving and doing well, and making them a part of that recruiting process as well.
Great, thank you. Have time for one last question. So as a mid-level employee, how can I actively be part of the solution without overstepping my boundaries? So if I'm at a particular level, how do I, without feeling overstepping, how do I help with this issue?
So I think I'm going to try to combine two questions in one, because I'm noticing also that someone asked about, when you're thinking about the university hierarchy, that there are students and faculty, but there's also staff.
And this can apply to workplace too, not just university, right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Thank you. So as far as staff, I'll answer that real quickly and then think about mid-level employees. For staff, we do have a vehicle at Xavier called this Staff Advisory Committee that normally meets twice a month, and they have a direct line to the president to bring staff voices forward. Over the summer, they've actually been meeting weekly and working tirelessly to make sure the staff voice is brought forward. It's certainly not uncommon for all in staff to also notice discrepancies with exempt versus non-exempt. And I think that's important for folks to consider. When I think about mid-level managers, I'm not sure where the question is coming from, but I do know that sometimes that, depending on the relationship with the leader, if they see the leader as a barrier, they may come to our office and ask us for help, to be honest. And how do I bridge that gap? Or are you able to do some training for our department and bring up these things that we're, for whatever reason, not able to. So I would also, for leaders out there that have people reporting to them, what kind of relationship do you have with the people that are reporting to you, so that keeps that dialogue open. But on campus, whenever there's mid-level managers that are struggling, it's not uncommon for them to come to our office and have us work through that, and then maybe provide some training or create an open dialogue about how we can move forward.
I'll just add really quickly, you know, I agree with what Tracy's saying, and I would also say some mid-level managers are in the ideal position because they understand multiple sides, right? Or they're probably better positioned to understand how the institution or organization works. So figuring out where you feel comfortable to insert yourself, and we all have a role to play in the organization. So if you're a mid-level manager, what can you do in that position? Are you doing, and if you have hiring power, are you doing the best that you can do around inclusive hiring in your position, right? And then other people will have to do the same. So don't feel like you have to tackle this large problem by yourself, but what can you do in your specific role that is in your wheelhouse that you can control? You know, I would advocate, you know, for that, you know, to be a model.
Perfect. All right, just to make sure that we're honoring everyone's time, I do want to share some additional resources with you. Let me share this for you. So one of the things that we've alluded to is our upcoming series on racism in the workplace. And actually, it's a 6-part series and a deep dive on what we've been discussing here today. So our very knowledgeable panel, Tracy, Carolyn, and Taj, will be leading these sessions, and we will cover many different topics that we've alluded to here today, but this series is designed to really give you practical, immediate things that you can immediately put in place in your organization to answer some of the questions that we had here today. So this is one resource for you. We're also going to send out in a follow-up email along with our survey. And the survey is designed to get more information to make these 6 sessions even more relevant to you and the questions and the needs that you have. But we'll also be sending a resource for different resources for you to use. The ones Tracy mentioned today in the session. And then also the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce has a resource page that we're going to share with you as well. One of the things that Taj mentioned was, you know, manager training, leadership development, and really having people understand as part of their skill sets how to lead with these tools. So the Xavier Leadership Center has many programs where we will, through our corporate university certificate programs, address some of those issues and help develop managers on up or soon to be managers. And then also we can come into your organization and deal with your specific needs in a custom program. So wanted to share that with you, and you'll be receiving more information on that as well. So we do want to thank you, and I personally want to thank Taj, Tracy, and Carolyn for sharing and being vulnerable and leading in the world in this space. I know you're all very dedicated and have helped the Xavier Leadership Center be a part of the solution. And we want to do that as we continue through this journey. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who was on the call today. If you want to send us an email or let us know whatever you have, or even additional questions, we're happy to reach out to the panel and get those answered for you offline. We're here for you and after this session as well. So thanks to everyone, and we hope to see you soon.